Hi, I'm hope I'm audible. Yeah, just give me 5 more minutes, okay? I will start around 6:10 o'clock. I had some urgent work that popped up. Okay, no 6:10, 6:15. Yeah, thanks. Oh, oof. Hi everyone. Thank you for joining. Yeah, thank you for your patience. We'll just start in a while. Uh, in the meantime, if you guys have any doubts or clarifications, do unmute or okay, please do unmute yourself or ask them. Okay, so yeah, thanks. And then I have few things to say at the end of the session, which I will get back to you at the end. So let's just start today's session uh, with the previous week assignment solutions. Okay, which of these is the largest source of sulfur oxides in the atmosphere? So, electricity generation, mobile sources, industrial processes, residential fuel. So, it's electricity generation because most still lot of our electricity demands are based on conventional thermal power stations. So thermal power stations tend to use a lot of coal, and then when you burn this coal, they have lot of it releases lot of sulfur oxides, majorly sulfur dioxide and all. So yeah, so that's why there have been you know uh, advocacy for uh, reduction in electricity generated through thermal power plants rather to use much more safer methods. Next one, those resources that are currently being used after surveying, quantification, qualification is a definition of. So we have surveyed for the resources, we have quantified, we have qualified, we have looked at the quality, and then though they are currently being used. So those are actual resources because we are currently using them. So if they can be used, then they can be other options. But since we are actually using them, so it's actual resources. Going ahead, rain gardens are primarily meant to. So what's the purpose of a rain garden? So they to reduce water usage, increase recharge to groundwater, protect existing water resources, or increase water flow to streams. So rain gardens' main purpose is to increase recharge of groundwater because this is for more focus for urban areas because in urban areas there is hardly any uh, open ground left because everything is either built up area in terms of houses or tar road or cement roads. So there's hardly any water that can actually percolate inside the ground, and whatever rains will be in most cases is actually diverted into the rivers, nearby rivers, through storm drains. So the main purpose is to recharge groundwater because we are continuously using them, taking out them, so we will be giving them a chance to be refilled. Okay. Oil that has not been drilled can be categorized under so potential resources, actual resources, reserve resources, and stock resources. So it can be categorized as a potential resource, but we know that the oil is there, but it has not been drilled. So it's a potential resource. Timber from forest that is being harvested can be categorized under. So here we are actually collecting the resources. So it is an actual resources. So the resources being gathered. So which of these is the largest source of ammonia in the atmosphere? Animal manure, mineral fertilizer, crops and the deposition, and human waste. So it's animal mainly. Those sort resources that have been surveyed but we lack the technology to use them is a definition of stock resources. So they have been surveyed, but currently we can't use. So they can become potential resources once we have the technology, and actual resources when we are actually using them. So we can't use them currently. So that's why they are in the category stock resources. Hydrogen from nuclear fusion comes under the category of a stock resource because we can't actually use that hydrogen that actually comes owing to nuclear activity. Those resources that may be used in the future is the definition of potential resources, so they can be used in the future. And the part of actual resources that can be developed profitably in the future is a definition of reserve resources. So we are actually using the resources, but they can be much more profitable in the future given certain things happen in certain manner. So those, that is reserve resources. Yeah. So that's all for the previous week assignment. So we'll slightly move ahead. Yeah. So I might not touch most of the topics that have been covered, but I would like to touch few aspects of how infrastructure actually affects wildlife and what are different ways that are being placed to mitigate them. So that's what today's session will be focused on. So if you want to discuss more on this, please feel free to, we can have a nice discussion, right? This is from a recent article that has calculated the human footprint for 2020. So they have used a lot of other things like pressure on the ecosystems, the human number of the human densities, and a lot of other things. So the areas that are in red actually are the areas where the human footprint is much more higher, but areas that are in dark blue shade, they have very little footprint. But all of the earth has some sort of human footprint, be it direct or indirect footprint. So much of the northern hemisphere, and then Africa, most part of the Africa, and then central Australia, and then even in the Himalayan region and Central Asian highlands. So these are the areas where we have very little human footprint due to a lot of other factors, such as most of these areas are not actually habitable for humans. So that the effect that humans have on those areas is very very little. But if you look at this map, let's just get the pointer. Yes. So if you look at the map of India here, uh, so sorry. So the Gangetic Belt, just below the Himalayas, the Indian subcontinent, even in the Pakistan, India, and even in Bangladesh. So it's heavily populated area owing to its fertile plain because most of the major rivers of India, Ganga, the Indus, the Brahmaputra, actually form a floodplain, right? So they are one of the fertile areas. So since India being a country which is has been dependent on agriculture and is still dependent on agriculture, so that's where people have been, sorry, have been present, and then they are modifying the environment accordingly. So some of the most of the modifications is the conversion of land. Like whatever the natural habitat is there, we are converting the land into land that is much more desirable for us, be it in terms of conversion from uh, conversion from forests to agricultural areas, or forest to build, or agriculture areas to built up areas, or grasslands to some other areas. So we were modifying like anything, right? So this actually captures all of that. So one of the ways we are modifying is actually in the form of linear infrastructure. As the population is growing, we need connectivity, right? So what all things actually come under linear infrastructure? They're just saying from the figure we can actually make out one. So what are the different forms of developmental things can be considered as linear infrastructure? Any guesses? Sorry. Roads, railways, pipelines, inland waterways. Yes, these are the major forms of linear infrastructure. Can ports, can a seaport be considered as a linear infrastructure or not? So the definition itself is there, right? So linear infrastructure is something that the infrastructure is actually kind of straight, not actually, mostly straight, and then it's pretty long, right? But if you consider in terms of a port, at that location the port might itself might not be linear infrastructure, but if you consider other factors it might be. So for this time period we do so broadly the definition you can think of linear infrastructures, any human built up stuff that is kind of mostly are linear because they are straight, like in terms of roads, most of our expressways, like you know Nagpur Mumbai expressway. So these are the or railway lines, these are mostly straight in most of these areas. We have pipelines, be it water pipelines or gas pipelines, especially in the European countries where there are a lot of gas pipelines, right? And then waterways. So these are all human modifications to the land, and then these modifications modify the land in such a way they are kind of linear in structure. So what all effects does do you think this linear infrastructure have on wildlife? What sort of effects? Roads, railways, because most of the time these linear infrastructure actually cut through and wildlife areas, like in India wildlife protected areas, national parks, wildlife sanctuaries, so on, or reserve forest. Okay, it fragments habitats. Okay, yeah, that's one of those things. uh it's one of the many things, right? Let's just go over one on one. Habitat fragmentation. There is not a single protected area. Yes, habitat loss. I forgot to mention that, but habitat loss is a main thing that happens because of this linear infrastructure. And then habitat fragmentation. So not only we are losing habitat because for development we have to change, modify. For instance, for making up a road or making up a railway line, you have to clear this much area, so and so meters of area, and then we have to actually increase the embankment so that a lot of things doesn't affect railways. So in a similar manner, we are resulting in a lot of habitat being lost, and then similarly habitat fragmentation. So in fragmentation, what happens is the because of this linear infrastructure we are actually dividing the habitat into two parts. It can be equal, it can be unequal, depending on the area and depending on the use. But the effect it has is huge. For instance, fragment habitat fragmentation can lead to movement of invasive species into these pristine areas, core of these areas. For instance, tiger reserve. Let's take a tiger reserve, which is circular, right? Let me just try to draw it. Okay. Uh, Sir, tiger reserve. If there is a proposed expressway that goes like this, right? Earlier, the road used to go somewhere like this. Since it's shorter, the government is hell bent on getting it straight. People are hell bent on getting things straight. So like let's have a straight road, cut down the distance, and then it's easy to travel. right? But what does it does is actually splits the habitat into two areas. And then since there are a lot of people actually coming, and then a lot of interactions that actually happen here, so there is a, increasing number of invasive species that actually come into these areas, which otherwise cannot actually enter the core. For instance, and there are humans activity that can actually increase and then affect wildlife. And there are, the worst thing are these feral dogs, right? They can have huge effect on a lot of organisms, be it mammals, be it birds, be it sorry. And similarly, cats also. So there are a lot of feral animals can actually come, they can cause a lot of damage. So all of these things happens because there is a linear infrastructure that is actually passing through that area, or else otherwise it was not accessible for that animal or for those species to actually access that area. And then displacement of species. So the other thing that happens is species are actually displaced from that area, right? They, so for instance, this small patch, small pond, right? If you think as it as a pond, when you actually have to build a road, you will actually fill up the pond, right? So species are, the, there is a habitat loss and the species are actually have to move from one place to another. So there is a displacement of species happening. And then the important thing is mortality, because of this lot of collisions. For there 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 are a lot of instances in news, that the tiger has been hit by a train, elephant has been hit by a train, especially in the West Bengal forests. Or bus hits a train, or elephant comes and tramples a human who is actually running on the walking on the road or going on a motorcycle. Rhinos trampling people. So there is a mortality of wildlife, there is a mortality of humans that actually happens. And then there are effects on population and demography. Like population can actually decrease due to a lot of other things. And then the sex ratios might change because uh, or the age structure might change because for instance, a lot of kids might just want to stay in the open area, so that they want to stay vigilant. But they are out in the open, they can be easily predated or they can easily die of collisions, right? So that can actually change the demography of the population of whatever the species, lot of species. And then it can have effects on health because you know as you, especially people in India, have a lot of you know cultural and religious connections with a lot of the species, right? And then when you see a species that has this culture or religious connection, you want to do something that 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 can act as a good deed in terms of you, but you're not helping because you are trying to feed the animal. You because you think that's a good deed, and you end up feeding the species food that is actually not natural for it, like for instance chips being fed to monkeys. A lot of people have might have seen that, right? So that actually have a negative impact on the health of the species. So a lot of these things have an effect on wildlife, especially these are just the result of linear infrastructure being passing through some of those areas that are heavily used by wildlife. And there are a lot of other effects also, right? So how to mitigate that? So there have been a lot of uh, ideas that have been brought up to understand how should we reduce the effect on that. We will slightly go ahead. So if you just look at the roadmap of road density of in Asia, just Asia, right? And then look at India, how dense it is. So the darker are the national highways. We have national highways, we have state highways, we have you know roads that actually goes connects villages, right? So it's just like crisscrossing network. And then if you overlay this network with protected area networks, and there is not even not a single protected area that is not cut by road or railway line or some sort of linear infrastructure. So most of these linear infrastructures actually pass through most of these protected areas. And then there's the same case not only India. Let's look at our neighbor China. Same. In some of the remotest parts, you might not see that sort of sorry, that sort of impact, because it's so remote or vast or not easy to go. You don't see much development there. And then, because at least, so the idea has been is, at least let's try to reduce some of the effects, negate the effects, right, by using some sort of means. So there are multiple methods. So one is underpass. So where, if there is a linear infrastructure going, especially majorly roads, so you can have underpass. The road can be actually elevated above the ground, and there is an open area, like flyover. We are, so it's the same thing. It's a there is a flyover built, and then there are fences that doesn't allow wildlife to actually pass through that. They can only pass through those underpasses, those structures. Or other thing is, they can actually have an overpass, a bridge for the wildlife, so that they can actually use the wildlife. But there will be no way these animals can actually cross onto the road. If they cross, there should be way that they can actually come out. So that's what this represents, right? And then it's not easy, because fencing whole sections of road, it's not feasible. So most of the times, these systems are actually placed in protected areas, or the targeting species, or targeting wildlife corridors. So if you remember, wildlife corridors are those section of areas where wildlife actually uses heavily to pass from one area to another for dispersal or a lot of other things. So, there in India at least, lot of uh, a lot of things are being done to make sure that, at least in the protected area, so whenever a linear infrastructure like roads or railway actually passes through a protected area, they have some sort of you know systems to help wildlife reduce the damage that is done to wildlife, be in terms of mortality, be in terms of population effects. Right, fencing these areas also prevent uh, some people from actually going and inside or outside the road to actually mess up with the wildlife. And then, so this actually works for wildlife that is actually can walk on the ground, but a lot of species cannot actually walk onto the ground, right? They are canopy dwelling species, like for instance gibbons. In India, we have this gibbon, hollow gibbon, and even in other parts of Asia, we have other species of gibbons, and there are some species of langurs, that are some species of macaques that don't actually come down generally to cross, but are being forced to come down, and that is resulting in a lot of mortality. So since these species actually dwell in the canopies, so this canopy bridges is used as a mitigating measure, so that the species can actually use them. So they can be as simple as just a couple of ropes, so so that these can actually use just climb onto the ropes and go on. Or it can be an elaborate, it can be ladder that actually connects. If the road is narrow, you can have ladders. Or you can have a small bridge also, like foot-over bridge that we have when we actually had to cross a lot of these busy national highways. A bridge, some sort of bridge, can also be built like that. So it takes times for the animal to learn that it's this is a safe passage. But once they learn that, they actually use them a lot. So this is an article that talks about the species of gibbon that actually seen using these installed canopy bridges. So there are multiple forms of canopy bridges. It depends on the species that are being targeted also. And then we have culverts. So this is for most of the ground dwelling animals, like uh, turtles or amphibians, reptiles, or even small mammals that may not be able to climb much, but can actually use these installed pipes into the ground. So these are generally used for drainage, right? If you go around a road, if there is a small drain waterway that comes, uh, that actually comes through there, So most of the times they're installed in that aspect, but whenever a new road is being built, and then if your target is to save some smaller mammals or animals, then you can actually have culverts installed. Like for instance, this is a domestic animal being using it, but a lot of animals tend to use these culverts. And then similarly, we have underpasses, right? So this is a wildlife area. This is also wildlife area where if a road is being built, they leave that, so they raise the road so that animals can actually pass that. And then the height should be taken care, of the animal that is actually being moving in this area. If it's just 2 meters tall or 1 meter tall, and you expect a elephant to cross that area, it doesn't make sense, right? A small mammal like a jackal can just run through. But so the height of the underpass should also be taken consideration, that how this works, what are the species that are supposed to use this underpass. And then the other major thing for culverts and underpasses when they are being built is, there should be sufficient light so that animal can see the other side and not be scared use that pass at all. So if it's actually can't see, if it's a lot darker, if it's way big, the animal might hesitate to use it at all. So it defeats the whole purpose of it. And then, sorry, and then the other concept is overpasses, where you allow the animal to actually cross over the linear infrastructure, mostly roads or railway tracks. And then and then to prevent animals coming actually onto the road, most of the time you build a lot of these fences that prevents the animal to actually coming onto the road. Because if you remember the death trap graph that was mentioned in the lectures. So at certain densities of uh, vehicular movement, there is a high probability of the animal to die. Like for instance, lower densities, very little probability, because there are very few animals, vehicles that are actually using the road. Animals can cross freely. At higher densities, the animals will not cross because they are so scared, because they don't see any gap on the road for them to cross safely. But in intermediate instances is what. So in some of those cases, they can there are these installments of fences, so that they don't actually jump over and get onto the road. So these are overpasses. And then most of these overpasses had to be made sure that it's accessible for the animals to use, and then it's not an alien habitat for the animal, so that it can't be just simple tar road or just a concrete structure. It's like, come and use this bridge, the animals will not use. It has to be some more familiar, like if you see in this picture, it has this some grasses, some small shrubs that are planted on that overpass to make it sure that animals can you know, are more familiar with this habitat and can use it. And then even in this picture, so that's important for overpasses. And then these overpasses also had to be fenced, so that these animals don't jump over the overpass onto the road. That also is not good for the people on the using the road and the animals. And then in India, we are also doing a lot of these. So there are a lot of underpasses, overpasses. So some of them are artistic illustrations, but some of them are actually coming up, right? uh, so let's just look at two examples. One is a flyover on Mumbai Nagpur highway. So they have built a overpass in one of those wildlife areas along with leopard proof fences, so that leopards can't actually jump. And then since it's an expressway, vehicles will be moving pretty fast. So that's happening. And then similarly, they have a proposed corridor also, like on the Raipur Vishakhapatnam highway that is going to be built. 27 animal passes. So how do we decide how many animal passes and where do we need animal passes? So this actually depends on the animal movement. Or for instance, if you just go back, If you look in this picture, if there is a water body and most of the animals actually have to come down to drink water, so the ideal thing will be should be that they should be close to the water body so that animals can quickly come down and then drink and go back and use that area. So or sometimes it actually comes along with the river or other aspects, or sometimes salt licks or some areas that these animals favor for certain reasons. So those things are have to consider when you are actually building these passes. You can't build a pass everywhere, right? So you have to prioritize in most of the cases. Okay, so that's just a linear infrastructure, especially roads and railways on land. But what about marine? So this is from this website marinetraffic.com. So if you look at the traffic of marine vessels, right? The traffic movement. Just see how intensely some of these areas are used actually, right? For transport of mostly goods, people, a lot of other things, right? So, but we know a lot of these marine mammals actually migrate, right? Move from one area to another. So they also migrate. For instance, a lot of these whales, let's just look at humpback whales. We most of us are familiar with the humpback whales. So this is the range. If you look at the way the world, so this is where most of you can spot an humpback whale if you go to most of these areas. And most of these satellite recordings, what they have found, so if you look at the orange patch, you know they actually hang out a lot around these areas along Australian coast. But if you simultaneously, oh, sorry, yeah, I'm extremely sorry, yeah. But if you just look at the vessel density or the traffic movement of these maps of marine vehicles, marine ships, and then the migration map of these animals, especially in the North Atlantic Ocean. See, lot of whales actually breed and migrate using the North Atlantic corridor. But same thing if you look on the traffic of this is one of those areas, it's heavily used routes. So there is a high chance of collisions. It's not or avoidance that might affect actually the mind. So collisions might occur frequently or infrequently depends, but it's not that frequent in most of the cases. But a lot of it affects whales, right? Because they had to actually cross this route. But sometimes the density of the vessels increase so much that they actually are deterred, especially if you happen to have listened to videos where you hear the propeller noise that is generated underwater. It's so huge, and then some of these whales use sound for communication, right? But and then they have so sensitive ears. But because of this they can actually avoid, they had to avoid those areas because they are so sensitive to most of the sounds. And then this marine traffic movement actually creates a heck of a noise. So that actually deters most cases that deters them. And sometimes that might also force some of these species to actually attack some of the uh, vessels. So most of the transport actually not only so there is not only the effect that we have on land, we also have a lot of our footprint on the ocean, in the ocean, and the ocean dwelling mammals, right? And you just look at the other aspect, the air. So this is just a couple of hours ago, the flight density map that we get to see, that I just managed to screenshot from this website. So this actually tracks flights. So if you look here, the density of flights, Europe lot of flights. India, few. US, a lot of them. Southeast Asia, especially Hong Kong, these areas, there are a lot of flights. So, but the interesting thing is, this the time that we are in is a time of migration for a lot of birds, right? So, so there are a lot of birds that actually migrate, and then they use specific paths when they actually migrate. So if you look here, uh, so the most of the birds that actually come to India, they use the Central Asian Highway, flyway. So they actually fly directly towards India. And there are some species that actually use West Asian East African flyway. So they migrate from West Asia, end up in East Africa. And some of the species are like European rollers, spotted flycatchers. They actually come through India and then go into Africa. They actually use these flyways. And then they have this own specific routes because this most of the time they use favorable wind patterns to be able to migrate easily, right? But flights also need that, right? So there's an overlap, and that's what ends up in most cases bird strikes. So it's not only migration. Most of the times, last year there have been in news that near Mumbai airport, near Ghatkopar, a lot of flamingos has been hit by an airplane, right? It happens because most of these airports are actually huge because of the runway they being need to be much more huge, right? And then that's an ideal area for a lot of birds to actually hang out because they are so open. Some species are open habitat species, or sometimes close to these airports, although the land is under some other government body or private body, are not developed. So that results in formation of wetlands, and wetlands attracts a lot of birds, especially during the winter season or migratory season. So that also can increase the chance of these air strikes. So there are a lot of methods in procedures in place to prevent these things from happening or to reduce the impact. So like we have radars that can actually detect birds, and then similarly uh, we have some places actually uh, a lot of these open areas like airports, we have a lot of pigeons. Not only airports, a lot of cities actually end up having a lot of pigeons, right? So they are also can end up potentially disastrous for people who are traveling in airplanes, right? So some places actually have predators like falcons or kites that can actually scare away these birds, or they can have sound cannons that can actually emit pulses of sound, so that uh, these animals can actually be scared away without nobody getting harmed. So there are a lot of ways that that this can be prevented, but it's major concern because a lot of these species migrate thousands of kilometers sometimes to come to these areas, and then we also want to travel but safely. So that's a dilemma that actually comes in. And similarly, the other forms of renewable energy that we are advocating these days is wind energy, right? Since we are discussing birds, I thought we can just bring up wind energy also. It's one of the most widely used source of renewable energy, and it's one of the oldest way to harvest energy. We used to have wind mills to actually do other things, and all countries in the world experience wind, and wind turbines can be set up. They can be set up offshore or on land, right? So the so it is that's why it's one of the heavily used sources of energy. And then form of wind energy, sorry, renewable energy. So mainland is these wind farms are on the land, and then offshore they're mostly present close to the coast but in the ocean. So that a lot of we have a lot of winds that actually hit the coast. so to be able to capture that energy. uh, so if you look at just this plot, so the amount of wind energy has actually gone up for the past 1 decade. You know that the number of windmills that are getting, producing a lot of electricity. And then one of the top countries is China, and then India is also there somewhere around that. So how sustainable is this energy? Let's just not go with this. But if you look at the, so it's not just, this is the safer option. It has its own environmental impacts. Uh, for instance, if you look at vegetation, especially during construction, you need to actually be able to transport this huge, you know parts. Especially one fan is, so one blade of this windmill is so huge that you need a very long truck to be able to carry it, right, from one place to another. So that has its own impact. So especially it affects vegetation, right? If you're doing this in area that has, especially if you look at in most of the areas where they are built are actually on top of hilltops, right? Mostly especially in the southern Indian context, because as you go higher, in some regions the winds actually hit those areas properly. So there's that's where it's protected to keep the wind forms, right? So during construction, especially, yeah, vegetation is impacted. So flora and fauna, if you look at impact on flora, it's there. And then especially birds are the worst impacted because of this. uh, and then it also generates a lot of noise. I'm sorry for this messy text, but noise, because these blades actually rotate, and then they have a lot of mechanical, gears mechanisms inside it. When rotated will make a lot of noise. So, and then actually it also is, it's not so most of the times, wind farms are they soar in the eye when you look in terms of landscapes, right? uh, and it also affects the local climate. So for instance, the wind that actually comes around there is actually lost in turning those things, but actually might not be able to go back and do its job. And then they have found that, uh, a study has found that temperatures increase by zero point 0.7 degrees because during the period where the wind farms were installed. So, but it has its own impact. So it affects climate because we are actually modifying. So we are not allowing the air to feel flow freely the way it used to free, right? And then it has also huge effect on vegetation, wildlife. If we and then, for instance, this picture, we have a lot of these migratory geese, right? They're actually landing in these wetlands, and then there are a lot of wind farms, and some species are not actually, you know can't actually see in front, or at the last moment they may not be able to negotiate much, so they end up hitting and dying, right? So especially there's a risk to flying animals, be it birds or bats, and especially for migrants. And then the direct impact is mortality from collisions. That's it. Indirect is, so they are they are, once they spot it, they just avoid that area because they don't want to go there. And then there is they are displaced, and there is habitat disruption. Like, and then, so especially the birds mostly affected are poor flying birds such as ducks, and then heavy birds such as bustards, because their field of vision is different than compared to other set of birds. And then the birds that concentrate in flocks, so most of these migratory birds that actually they move in huge flocks, right? So they are also at greater risk of collisions. And some of this sorry, yeah, this is a raptor that has migrated a lot of kilometers from, and then it just end up after dying, after colliding with wind farms. And then sometimes they don't actually have to collide to die, because these wind farms, when they rotate, they create a kind of vortex, you know uh, so if this is a you know windmill, let's just draw it. When it rotates, it can actually kind of create a vortex behind it. And then if you remember, birds, they have bones that are not dense. So for them to able to be fly, the bones have air pockets, and they are much more lighter. So once a lot of these tiny birds that actually migrate, if they get stuck in these vortexes, that's the end, because these vortexes are so strong they can actually crush some of the bones, and if a wing bone is crushed, it can't fly, and then it's just done for the day, or done for its life. So some of those renewable energy sources are also, they do have their own impact. If you look at water as a form of renewable energy, uh, renewable source of energy, the dams can actually prevent a lot of these migratory fishes from actually moving from one place to another. If you talk in terms of solar, it has its own area. Like, we are actually modifying the habitat to be able to construct solar farms, right? You can't just, so it's not really efficient to have one solar panel. That will be good, but a lot of times you have to have farms to be able to meet the demands of cities or some industrial settlements, to be able to make that much of electricity. So they actually leads to modifications habitat. So most of these renewable sources of energy are in general, uh, look so cool, but they have their own effects on wildlife. Yeah. So yeah, that's all I have for today. So if you guys have anything, I'd be happy to discuss more about that. And then, yeah, anything related to these effect of these linear infrastructure or renewable forms of energy. If you want, I can discuss some of the effects that solar farms and wind, sorry, water, renewable source of energy like dams can have on wildlife in the next session. If you guys are interested, I can deal with that, or we can deal with whatever is being taught in the class. Uh, I think and the other thing is, I think the next week is the last session, if I'm not wrong. Uh, because yeah, so if you have any clarifications from any of the topics from start to end, please feel free to let me know, so that I can try to cover them in the next session, because I may not be able to take an extra session after those 12 weeks, because I have other stuff to do. So yeah, if you have anything, do let me know here. Uh, yeah, thanks. If not, that's the end of the session for today. So I will wait for a couple of minutes for us to, for if anybody have any doubts. If not, we can end the session here. Yeah, thank you for being patient, and then in being interacting, interacting in the sessions. Yeah. I think that should be the end of today's session. Thank you.